I see that we have another question. Thank you. So here is another question from Eileen S. Eileen S. asks, do you have any advice for introducing and cultivating a love of poetry to my children? And this is a question that I never tire of discussing because my own experience of poetry, uh, especially when I was in school, because I went to conventional schooling, uh, was less than satisfactory. And the reason for that is this. In the schools that I happened to go to, poetry was often taught as a kind of intellectual game or intellectual puzzle. Poems were sort of strange, obscure pieces of writing with arranged in a funny way on the page with shorter lines, and they often used metaphors, and they often didn't make sense at first. And so I had the impression that poems were things that were hard to understand, that you had to work at to figure out the real meaning of. But in the years since my formal education, I came to have an understanding of poetry which was vastly different from that one. And that understanding of poetry is that poetry is simply the expression of deeply felt emotion and experience in the not only the smallest number of words, but in the way in which those words say the most. And the best way, and I think the quickest way to taste and experience poetry is to, instead of looking at it as a puzzle, is to read it out loud. To read poetry out loud, or to listen to poetry out loud, and to enjoy the music of the words, to enjoy the rhythms of the words, the way that different sounds join together or rhyme or chime or sort of reverberate against each other. There's a poem that I learned when I became aware, when I had my own entry into poetry, from Edna St. Vincent Millay, and it begins with a very simple line: we were very tired, we were very merry, we had gone back and forth all night on the ferry. And if you listen to that, you can see it has the movement almost like the waves in the water that you might imagine the ferry boat going across. We were very tired. We were very merry. We had gone back and forth all night on the ferry. And you can see already here we are telling a story, but we're telling a story in a very particular way, a way that is awakening us to not just the meanings of words, but the sounds of words. So my single most urgent advice and suggestion to you is to read some poems out loud. Enjoy the sounds of the poems, even if you don't understand everything that they're saying. In many ways, that's the secondary concern, a very much a secondary concern. There is, for instance, a famous example in English of a poem which has words that are made up, which is the Jabberwocky poem by Lewis Carroll from Through the Looking Glass. I recommend, depending on the age of your students, you might take a peek at that at whatever time would be right, where Lewis Carroll makes up words. And what's so interesting about what Lewis Carroll does is that he makes them up in such a way that they sound like they could be real words. And in fact, this is an interesting activity to try with students, is to say, well, what if what makes a word sound like a word and not a bunch of mumbo jumbo? So for instance, if I wanted to make up a word and I said it's just a split or something like that, that just feels like a random sense of sort of smushing together of words. But if I made up a word like splain, I'm just combining the word plane and spleen, for instance, and I say splain, we have it almost sounds like a part of the word explain. But if I just say splain, clearly it's not a word that we commonly use in English, but it has a word-like quality to it. In fact, you can make up whole poems of made-up words just for the fun of the enjoyment of exploring the sounds of words. And then when you come away from that kind of activity and read a poem by a great poet out loud, you can start to see how that poet has taken words which have meanings that can resonate with us, not only in our minds, but in our hearts. And by giving them a certain rhythm or a certain sense of music, those words become more memorable and more meaningful to us. So, and I see in the chat that Eileen says we've been studying poetry through pop song lyrics, which seems to help engage their interest. I think that's wonderful. There are schools of thought which would think that pop song lyrics and poetry are two very separate things, but that's not necessarily the case. There can be some very eloquent uh, 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 poetic turns of phrase in pop songs that we hear all around us all the time. Um, I remember hearing a song. This is not a pop song; it was a gospel song. But there was a phrase about the help that a person might want in their life, and the line was something like, "It," meaning the help. It may not come when you want it, but it always comes on time. It's a very short bit of just a very short pair of phrases, and yet it captures a whole sort of experience by playing with language, with expectation, with timing, and so on. So I'm delighted by this question, Eileen, and I'm delighted that you've been studying poetry through this way, and I heartily encourage you to continue um, playing with the sounds of words. And one last thing Eileen mentions, we were just using songs from the new West Side Story film, like Somewhere. And that's also beautiful because there is, in fact, some wonderful poetry in the lyrics from West Side Story, the stage musical, as well as the now two movie versions. Any way that allows us to enjoy the music of words is a fruitful way to explore. That would be my very strong advice and encouragement to you. So that is my response to the question of how to cultivate and encourage a love of poetry in young people.